Wonderful. I guess we'll go ahead and get started if everyone's ready to go. Good.
Yes.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Avery Marshall, and I'm the Program Director for the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice. My pronouns are he, him, his. If you're unfamiliar with our work, the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice is a nonprofit dedicated to achieving respect through dialogue and education. And this conversation on resilience, I think, will help us understand what we can do for our communities, but also what we can do for ourselves in order to make this more possible. Our moderator today will be Moises Echeverria, who is the Executive Director of the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice. And he has served as a consultant for organizations committed to improving their diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. And he is passionate about inclusion, diversity, and equity. And he also serves in the Oklahoma Advisory Commission for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the Tulsa City County Library Commission as a mayoral appointee, and in the Tulsa Public School Superintendent Community Advisory Committee. Moises obtained his bachelor's degree in business administration from Oklahoma State University and his master's degree in human relations from the University of Oklahoma. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Moises.
Thank you, Avery. And I want to say thank you to our panelists, our amazing group of folks that I really respect and admire for their work. And I'd like to introduce them. So first we have Dr. Chen Hellman, who is a professor of social work at the University of Oklahoma and is the director of the Hope Research Center. He has written more than 150 scientific publications and has presented at numerous national and international conferences worldwide. Dr. Hellman's research is focused on hope as a psychological strength, helping children and adults overcome trauma and adversity. He is the author of the award-winning book, Hope Rising: How the Science of Hope Can Change Your Life, with co-author Casey Wynn, and published by Morgan James. Next, we have Krystal Reyes, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Tulsa, overseeing the city's resilience strategy that calls for using a racial equity and social justice lens in all city policies, programs, and practices. Previously, she held various positions in government and nonprofit sectors in New York City, coordinating multidisciplinary, community-led, and citywide efforts to address disparities in health. Throughout her career, Krystal has focused on improving the quality and quantity of early education opportunities for children, improving supports for families, and developing meaningful community partnerships. And last but not least, we have Dr. Mary Waters, who served as a school counselor for many years and has helped countless students of all ages. She worked at the elementary, middle, and high school levels throughout her career. And now she is working to educate the next generation of school counselors at Northeastern State University, teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in the College of Education, Department of Psychology and Counseling. She has also been an invaluable volunteer for OCCJ for many years. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you for being with us this morning. So when I think about resilience, I think of the most basic definition, which is our ability to recover quickly from some distress or difficulties. And I want to ask each of you, how would you define resilience through the lens of the work that you do? And how does an individual demonstrate it?
So I'd be happy to jump in on that. And so one of the things that has always concerned me about that definition of resilience, of the ability to bounce back, is when individuals live in extremely adverse environments and conditions, or most of my work is in domestic violence and child maltreatment. And so the idea of bouncing back into adversity is not necessarily sort of the end game. So for me, the idea of resilience is adapting to adversity so that an individual has the opportunity to thrive, to either overcome the adversity or to find ways to live well within the adversity that they experience. So that's kind of my framework with resilience.
Thank you for sharing that.
And I'll add to that a bit that the approach that urban resilience takes, and this is the urban resilience practice definition, is the ability for individuals through organizations, businesses, whole cities to survive, adapt, and thrive through chronic stressors or acute shocks. And so I think as I talk about that definition, that resonates with a lot of people because it's so applicable at the individual level and at a citywide and nationwide actually level. And I agree with Dr. Hellman about that the bouncing back to either quickly or to the state that you were in previously is not always true, especially for those that may be familiar with grief. The ability to get through grief, you come out different on the other side, but with the right supports, and we'll talk about that later, how people build that, you can begin to thrive again.
Yeah, and I'm glad I'm last, because what each of you, Krystal and Dr. Hellman, said really resonates with the work that I've done in schools. And that's when our school community, meaning teachers, counselors, administrators, and families, can be on the same page with with our children in the most need. That's where we see the best success in terms, not so much in bouncing back quickly, but just being able to make adjustments and continue to take steps forward. And sometimes that's what we see with our kids, our children and adolescents, is the ability to just get up and take steps forward.
Thank you all. I really appreciate this contrasting definition from the definition that I think most of us relate to or think about when we think about resilience. So thank you for that. Can you talk about how individuals and perhaps organizations or communities build resilience?
Well, I'll jump in again up front. So the work that we've been doing is really been focused on creating a hope-centered approach. And so, hope is the basic framework of believing that the future will be better and that you have the power to make it so. And so using the framework of hope at the individual level, we know that the research is very consistent that hope is one of the single best predictors of our ability to thrive. At the organizational level, or at the community level, we're much more interested in collective hope. And that's the idea that we can generate a shared vision for the future. And it's really the pathways component or the strategies to achieve that future that we oftentimes find ourselves in conflict with and to debate that. So we tend to frame individual at the hope level and at the community or organizational at the collective level.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, go ahead, Krystal.
Oh no, all right, you can go.
Okay. I was just going to say, in conjunction with Dr. Hellman's work, so one initiative that I'm very hopeful about in Oklahoma is the individual career academic plans that have been mandated that each student last year, starting in the 9th grade, has to complete. And that can sound like a checklist that's not very meaningful, but we know from the research that students that have purpose achieve at greater levels. So like purpose is almost like a proxy for hope. And here's the really hopeful part of that research, that students actually from low income and minoritized backgrounds have higher purpose scores than students in the general population. And so if we can do that work very intentionally, not using the ICAP as merely a checklist to check off mandates, but to really sit with students and talk to them about the purpose, what's their purpose in life. And I mean, that may sound very high-minded, but that's exactly what needs to happen. And if we can do that in a way across the state, I can't even begin to think of what we could yield from that, those conversations.
And I'll just add a perspective from, again, this urban resilience practice framework, but also how it so much relates to the individual level. And so, you know, in this urban resilience definition, there are 7 qualities of a resilient sort of system, project, program, resilient city. And I'm going to name all 7, and then I wanted to touch on 3 of them that I think really resonate with this individual sort of characteristics we can build, and also relating to hoping and planning. So they're being reflective, being resourceful, being inclusive, integrated, robust, redundant, flexible. And so all those are qualities of a resilient program, policy, city, and I think individual too. So the first one, you know, related to reflecting. So reflecting on the past. So as a city, being able to name, particularly for Tulsa, naming our painful past, as well as the successes or the progress that has been made, but naming both of those things is important to learn lessons and move forward. And at an individual level, being able to reflect on what you were able to accomplish in maybe times of adversity, or how far you've come is important to give you a sense of, you know, what are the skills you've gained to be able to move forward and adapt and thrive. Being integrated in an urban resilience practice is that you're breaking down sort of silos and combining different disciplines. And I think in your personal life, you can do that too, making sure that you're not, you know, 5 different people in 5 different settings, figuring out how to manage that energy. So the cognitive work isn't so big, transitioning from whatever work or volunteer or personal thing that you're dealing with. And then the inclusive part. So as a city, we're trying to do this, being as inclusive as possible and bringing voices to the table to help us move Tulsa to a more equitable place. And I think at the individual level, that also speaks to being able to have the supports around you, and diverse supports that can help you in different aspects that you need. And I know, as I, you know, kind of sharing more personally, that, you know, when I reflect on, you know, working through my own grief and surviving, adapting, and we're all still thriving, trying to figure out how to thrive. It was the people and supports that came around that really helped me get through those moments. So the work of resilience is very personal to me, and it's very professional to me. And it really, these 7 qualities, I think about them probably too much all day.
Krystal, can you name those 7 qualities again, just so that we can
Sure.
all hear them one more time?
And there's a lot of R's in them. So if anyone would like to create a mnemonic device, I'd love to hear it. So reflective, resourceful, inclusive, integrated, robust, redundant, and flexible.
Thank you for that. And Krystal, I have a follow-up question for you. So the city of Tulsa is one of 100 cities who participated in a program called the 100 Resilient Cities. A little bit redundant there on my part, but this program has formally ended. There's still some support given to the cities that participated, not necessarily to compare us to other cities, but talk about how we're doing as a city. So what are our strengths? I know you mentioned a few things already when you talked about the 7 qualities, but so what are our strengths and what are our areas of improvement?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the Resilient Cities Network actually was very resilient in that the organization that had funded it sunsetted it technically, but the chief resilience officers from around the world, because this wasn't just a United States effort, there are nearly 100, they got CROs, gathered together, organized, and continued this network and received some funding from that organization to develop the next phase of it. And so that still continues. We're still part of that network. Tulsa is in company with 28 other cities across the country that are using a resilience framework and have a resilience strategy. And about 60 other countries around the world that are focused on resilience too. And so we have not ranked all the cities in terms of their resilience. Probably not a good idea to do that, but we I think as Tulsa have, and especially, I've been here a short time, but from what I've seen and what I know, what I've heard throughout the most recent years, there has been this effort to integrate and apply these principles, whether folks knew that these were the resilience principles or not. And so we are making efforts to make city government more open and having diverse voices at the table in our authorities, boards, and commissions. We are creating pathways for people to participate in government. And we're trying being flexible around how we do plans, how we make, decisions. And so I think we're on a road, and I think that the first quality that I mentioned, being reflective, that is a hard work, and it's part of our overall efforts to normalize what we hope is a racial equity lens in this city. And so that is hard work that community members are doing, people in city government are doing, and a lot of cities are actually looking to us how we're doing this, talking about the race massacre, talking about the history of displacement for Native American communities, talking about policies for new immigrants. And so I think, in a lot of ways, Tulsa is, people are looking to Tulsa, how we're doing this and how we're learning our lessons, how we're stumbling, but also how we're making it through. And I think that's something that makes Tulsa very resilient.
Thank you. I think we're so fortunate for sure to be one of these 100 cities around the world who have these very well thought out and organized plans. And so thank you, Krystal, for the work that you do. Dr. Waters, I wanted to ask a question of you in regards to your work and the relation that you've seen in resilience and psychology, and kind of how you've helped students for many years. Now you're helping future counselors. So how do they correlate?
Yeah, I really try to work from a lens that's not deficit, from not a non-deficit lens with the work. The work that we do in schools is complicated and extremely, extremely difficult. It's not individual therapy, but you need the therapeutic skills to do the work. And so it's very hard. It's easy to get into that deficit mindset. Oh, if only the parents, or if only, our schools were better funded. And some of it does need to change, but we have to work from a strengths-based, at least from my perspective. I'd like my students to work from a strengths-based perspective, to look at the strengths in the students. And that's how we can begin to build that resilience. Just piggybacking on what Krystal said, we look at what we're doing well in this city to go forward, right? We don't just look at everything that's problematic, and without ignoring what's problematic. So yeah, I definitely work from strengths-based perspective, and really want to inculcate that in my students. Thank
you for sharing that, Mary. It really reminds me of some of the work that we do at OCCJ that you have been part of at Anytown, where when we introduce the concept of intersectionality and help students identify those areas where they have privilege, and they can utilize that privilege to advocate for themselves and their communities, and not focus on on their identities that have faced oppression and feel like victims, but to really empower them to use whatever platforms or privilege they have for advocacy, self-advocacy. So thank you for highlighting that. I love the strengths-based approach. Dr. Hellman, the research that you have led around hope is really fascinating, and I am just in awe, and I love that you have had opportunities to travel around the world to share your findings. Can you talk more about hope and the theory of hope and how individuals can utilize or find hope to thrive?
Sure. So, and thank you for that. So hope, as I mentioned earlier, hope is based upon the belief that the future can be better and that we have the power to make it so. And so we identify hope as a way of thinking, not as an emotional reaction. And the reason that that's so important is because hope is something that can be taught. Hope is something that can be learned. And our work has focused really on those who have experienced tremendous trauma and adversity. So, hope is good for everybody. But when we take a trauma-informed framework and recognize the adversities that individuals have experienced and how that influences their capacity to hope, then it provides a framework for us to begin to nurture hope in a very specific context. Hope is really made up of three simple ideas. It is based upon the goals that we set. And within the goals that we set, we have to be able to identify the pathways or the mental roadmaps of how we get there from here. That's referred to as pathways thinking. Pathways thinking also involves our ability to perceive barriers to those pathways and to begin the problem-solving process to either overcome the barriers or to find alternative pathways. And then the final component, which is willpower, is our ability to generate the motivation to pursue those pathways. So hope is about goals, pathways, and willpower. And I'll real briefly say that during times of adversity and stress, like our communities are experiencing, the nature of the goals that we set become very important. So we either set achievement-oriented goals or things that we want to pursue, or we begin to look at, especially in times of adversity, we're more likely to begin setting avoidant goals, things that we don't want to happen. And the way we set those goals dictates the way we think about the pathways of how to get there. We also distinguish between short-term goal setting and long-term goal setting. In particular, what's going on now in our communities, we tend to be focused much more in the 24 to 48 hour goal setting stage. Long-term goal setting seems to lose some of its capacity when we're in the experience of adversity. So those are the three components. And I will say this, that in regards to hope and resilience, hope is the mindset that drives resilient behaviors. So an individual or community has to have hope that the future will be better in order to engage in those activities that make them resilient to adversity.
Thank you, Dr. Hellman, for your words. I think that the way in which you explain hope in those three areas of goals, the pathways, and the willpower, is both beautifully simplistic and so complex and so profound. And I just really appreciate all the work that you've spent researching this. So, Dr. Hellman, you kind of referenced just generally current events. And so right now we are in the middle of a pandemic. And there has been so many changes that all of us have experienced, and then some individuals have experienced really hardships, including losing loved ones, losing jobs. I mean, so many things. And then most recently, we are in the midst of these heightened racial tensions. And things that have existed and that some members of our community have been very aware of for generations, and some other people are just discovering that this is a reality for members of our community. So as it comes to resilience, what is your advice? How can we be supportive of individuals, knowing that not everyone is experiencing these things in the same way?
Sure. So I think the first thing, during the pandemic, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, what we all experienced and what we saw sort of prevail in the media was this fear and uncertainty. And what happens during fear and uncertainty is we begin to experience this emotional response. And that emotional response centered around fear, it's a natural, normal response. And so, I don't want to give the perspective that, what I'm advocating is that people should just wake up every morning and be happy or be hopeful. These are natural, normal, functional emotions. The problem is if we stay engaged in that emotion-based sort of coping response, because fear will ultimately lead to despair. And when we begin to experience despair, desperate actions tend to follow. And sometimes those desperate actions can be very dysfunctional for us. And so what we've been working towards is how do we interrupt that idea of worrying about the future or ruminating in the past, so that an individual can be hopeful. And so it really is beginning to embrace the science of hope, which is the simplicity that you talked about, which is beginning to look at goals and embracing short term. What can we accomplish this week? What can we accomplish today? And then how do we set the steps or the plans that are needed to pursue that? What we've learned in our research is that hope begets hope. And what I mean by that is, as we begin to experience success towards our goals, even in the short term, that it begins to propel our confidence that we can achieve that future. And so, we look at the times that are going on, not only in the pandemic, but over the last, few days or several days. And, we begin to see that this idea of equity and voice and hardship, are coming to the forefront, and they're being, identified or voiced. And so, the idea of protesting becomes a pathway by which to achieve the goal. And then, we can start to debate, I suppose, sort of the additional actions that either enhance our pathways or serve as barriers, the violence and the looting. Is that a pathway to voice, or does that become a barrier to sharing a voice? And I think people can debate that idea, but it really is, Moises, taking these basic concepts of setting goals, finding pathways, and then creating the steps by which to achieve those. And the data is very clear on the results of that.
Thank you. Krystal or Dr. Waters, would either of you like to share your thoughts on that question?
thought Dr. Hellman did a great job of addressing those two topics. I think your question around what we can do to support, I think understanding that sort of what Dr. Hellman said around pathways and actions as part of demonstrating hope and trying to make your way through. I think also, as I mentioned, those qualities around making sure that there's connection, that there's community, that communities are connected and that people are connected. So this is very practical, very individual level, but reaching out to people and asking if they are okay, either through digital media or actually asking someone if they're okay, because that social connection is very important in the individual level and for communities, that we are creating cohesive communities that can support each other through a pandemic. And we saw this in Tulsa. The other way I would say we're so resilient is the amount of community organizing and individual local micro solutions that were created during this pandemic to feed people, to make sure that our elders were also fed, that they were okay, that children were fed. So I think that can't happen without some level of connection, and then identifying, recognizing that there are people that are disconnected and that we need to address that.
Yeah, I'll just say we, on just a very micro level, we have internships going on this summer in clinical mental health, and we contacted Tulsa Public Schools. I was really impressed and happy to see that Tulsa Public Schools has a helpline that's going on through the summer to continue to be in touch with parents and kids, and to offer, emergency first aid kind of mental health. We also contacted 211 and got a response there as well. And what I've heard from the executive director of 211 and from Tulsa Public is that all the community is coming together in the pandemic. Of course, we do have people that are suffering and living on the margins, and we shouldn't forget about them at all. But I think the community is making a concerted effort to try to web together services to help our community. And that certainly, on a very, very micro level, gives me hope that we're gonna get through this.
I think that it is during these difficult times, to all of your points, where we can oftentimes see the beauty of humanity as a whole, and people organizing, mobilizing, ensuring that the most vulnerable amongst us are taken care of. And I think both Dr. Waters and Krystal, you mentioned about the at the very micro level, some of the things that we are seeing in the city of Tulsa, to make sure that those who are disconnected in some way or another have the resources they need during these difficult times. So I want to, before I ask the last question I have for the panel, I want to remind those who are viewing that if you have any questions for the panelists, to make sure that you drop them on the comment section, and I'll be happy to ask that of the panelists. But the last question I have for you is, if you could talk about when are individuals or communities most vulnerable of not being resilient, or if you want to look at it on the opposite hand, when are individuals and communities most likely to be resilient?
Well, we've had Dr. Hellman always start, so I'll take a stab at this. I think that it's so, from my work, anecdotally, it's so hard to predict that, really. But it all goes back to relationships, I think, and even students that I've worked with that have had really tremendous adversity. What we can really almost figure out and point back to a few people or just one person having a solid relationship with that person. And in light of Dr. Hellman's research, it's really that person who's been able to help them set goals and let them see that there are pathways, and really supported the willpower. You know, when I think about that, that's really what it's about. And those individuals might not have ever read research on hope, but that's what they're doing intuitively as a human being. So, you know, I really hope that we don't look at the ACEs study as a predictive model, right? You know, oh, somebody who has 4 ACEs, they're, you know, it's all over for them, you know. So, you know, I think that we have to look at that ACEs study with a great deal of caution, right? Because it's not, there may be predictive outcomes in that model, but in my work, you know, it's really about having solid relationships with families and with students, and continuing to look for those pathways.
And I'll go next. I think just to reiterate that at the individual level, I think that as Mary said, the connection, having even just one person to be able to reach out to help you problem solve, to help you give an example of what's possible, I think is important. And then I think the city level, it's similar. If there is a way for people to feel connected to their government, their sort of institutions that can help create the city we want, I think that's what we're trying to do, is make sure that we have partners in creating a Tulsa that's inclusive and equitable and resilient. And so making sure that we have connections, I think, can avoid people feeling like they don't have that sense of power or the ability to plan or to affect change. And that's at the individual level, and it's at the group level that happens.
Yeah, this is both of those are exactly right on. You know, it turns out that hope is a social gift, and you know, I've heard Emeka make that statement multiple times in our community. And at the individual level, I think what people have to recognize is that, you know, you don't have to be a therapist to positively impact somebody's life. There are these, you know, 5-minute conversations that have tremendous impact on an individual, a child, or an adult's ability. And it's all about those relationships. And I really love, you know, thinking about this at a community level, and the way that areas in our communities are more or less connected in the built environment, and how that can influence isolation or connectedness. And so we have to be, I think, very intentional in creating those relationships, you know, which is grounded in trust and leadership, you know, and again, that idea that we have somebody in our community that we can go to in times of trouble, at the end of the day, is what that boils down to. So hope is very much a social gift.
Thank you all. So there's one question that I wanted to ask as well that someone shared. And this is in regards to the concept of historical trauma, that there's some individuals who, when they learned about or are reminded about incidents of injustice, of pain, from generations ago, that they still feel as though they're going through that themselves. So the question kind of touches historical trauma, but it's really focused. How do we, as leaders, as individuals who care about our community, how do we help others who are rightfully, you know, hurting, they're angry, there's trauma, and what is our way to reach out to them and to help them in their way? And I think all of you have talked about it. How do we help others? But specifically those who have a history of of injustices.
So the opposite of hope turns out is not despair, it's apathy. And, you know, when we give up and when we believe that no matter what we do, there's no way that we can achieve the future that we desire. And so, you know, and that's where most of our work in the community and research has been, in despair and apathy. And the good news is that we can improve and nurture hope in despair, and we can nurture hope in times of apathy. We all have the capacity to hope, and hope is good for everyone. You know, I think that if we recognize this trauma and this history of trauma at the individual level, but if we begin to look at historic trauma, these become barriers to pathways by which to achieve those goals. And so I think we have to begin to find ways to focus on a collective hope model, because we can begin to have shared discussions that can help us understand these diversity issues, that can help me understand pathways that I never knew existed before by conversations with you and others. And so we can begin to look at strategies to nurture hope, to help individuals and groups overcome adversity.
Yeah, and I would think in that model too, it's a trust. Trust is a huge part of that. And I think disenfranchisement is a lack of trust that the institutions are holding, that the institutions are going to respond in a way that is trustworthy. You know, trust is about the feeling that people are honest and competent, benevolent. And so I think trust can lubricate the whole idea of bringing our community together. And of course, once trust has been harmed, it's really hard to build back up. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of our communities and that have been impacted by the Tulsa massacre, by the historical trauma of the genocide. Our undocumented folks who've been in abeyance for so many years with not having a pathway, right? I mean, that's the nature of being undocumented. You don't have a pathway, you know. So I think we have a lot of work to do.
I'll just add one small point, again, at the individual level. You know, I think the question is like, where do we begin, or where could we begin to support? And I think, you know, one of the first great acts of courage is to sit with someone in their pain, and to not explain it for them, to not try to make them, you know, mitigate any way that they are describing it. I think that's just on an individual level. I think probably probably all of us have experienced someone who was just there to listen and sit with us in our pain. And I think as a city, we all have to sit with the pain of our past as a city. And that, you know, can't just be on the shoulders and on the burden of people of color. And so the whole city needs to sit with that pain. And we are doing that as a city. But I just wanted to name that's a beginning for both at the individual level and the city level.
Perfect. Thank you all so very much. We are out of time, so I want to thank you all so much for what you share. I think if I was to put it all in a nutshell, the definition I heard from you about resilience is the ability to adapt to adversity, and feeling connected, having a network where we can thrive, that helps us to thrive. I loved, Krystal, your perspective of resilience at the community level and the qualities that you shared, that communities that are resilient. They are reflective, resourceful, inclusive, integrated, robust, redundant, and flexible. Dr. Hellman, your research about hope, and that when individuals are able to have goals, that they're able to identify pathways to achieve those goals and have the willpower to go through the process to achieving them. That's what creates hope, and that hope is learned, that is not a feeling, it's not an emotion, and that the opposite of hope is apathy, which oftentimes we don't think that as the opposite of hope. So thank you for all the work and research that you've done. And then Dr. Waters, I mean, there's so many things that you said that are so important, but I love your approach, your strengths-based approach to helping individuals and helping them understand all the great things that and resources and abilities that they have to be able to move forward and advance in their academic path. So thank you all for your time, for all the work that you do in our community. Our community truly is better because of you. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Avery.
Right, and I just want to thank you all again for joining us today and for giving all of your expertise to us and all sharing your resources. One thing that became clear in this conversation is how powerful community can be in just in how resilient we are as individuals and as a greater whole. And asking people what their purpose is and sort of understanding what their strengths are so that we use that for our resilience as a whole is amazing. So thank you all again for joining us, and everyone can keep track of OCCJ on our website, www.occjok.org, and you can also keep up with this on Instagram and through Facebook as you are now. And again, thank you all for joining us today and being a part of this conversation. And please keep watch for our other panel discussions that'll be happening later. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.